Syria was once a land of ancient history and vibrant culture. Its cities were bustling with life, and its streets echoed with the sounds of daily commerce and social gatherings. The country was a mosaic of different cultures and traditions, each contributing to the rich tapestry that was Syria. Located in the heart of the Middle East, it was home to diverse groups. The geographical location made it a crossroads of civilizations, where East met West, and ancient trade routes converged. This diversity was reflected in the people, architecture, and even the cuisine. Sunni Arabs were the majority, but other groups like Alawites, Kurds, and Christians also lived there. Each group had its own unique customs and traditions, yet they coexisted, contributing to the country's multifaceted identity. The country had been ruled by the Assad family since 1970. Hafez al-Assad, a former Air Force officer, took power through a military coup and established a regime that would last for decades. Hafez al-Assad, followed by his son Bashar al-Assad in 2000, maintained tight control. Political freedom was limited. Bashar, initially seen as a potential reformer, continued his father's legacy of authoritarian rule. In the 2000s, Syria faced challenges. The economy was struggling, and there were significant disparities between urban and rural areas. While cities like Damascus and Aleppo thrived, the countryside lagged behind. A severe drought hit the country hard. This drought, one of the worst in decades, devastated the agricultural sector, which was a lifeline for many rural communities. Crops failed, livestock perished, and water sources dried up. Many farmers lost their livelihoods and moved to cities. This mass migration put additional strain on urban areas, which were already struggling with unemployment and inadequate infrastructure. This added to existing economic problems and social unrest. The urban poor grew increasingly discontented, and the gap between the rich and the poor widened. Protests and demonstrations became more frequent as people demanded better living conditions and more opportunities. People grew frustrated with corruption and lack of opportunities. The government's inability to address these issues led to widespread disillusionment. Corruption was rampant, and many felt that the system was rigged against them. The Arab Spring uprisings in 2011, toppling regimes in Tunisia and Egypt, inspired hope for change in Syria too. People saw the possibility of a new beginning, a chance to break free from decades of oppression. However, Syria under Assad was different. The regime was deeply entrenched, and the government was prepared to use any means necessary to stay in power. The initial peaceful protests were met with brutal force, and the situation quickly escalated. The government was highly authoritarian and used its security forces to crush dissent. The response was swift and ruthless, with security forces cracking down on protesters, arresting opposition leaders, and using violence to intimidate the population. There was a climate of fear, and any opposition was swiftly silenced. People were afraid to speak out, knowing that they could be arrested, tortured, or even killed. The regime's tactics created an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust. Years of oppression and economic hardship created a tinderbox, ready to ignite with the slightest spark. The combination of political repression, economic struggles, and social tensions made the situation in Syria increasingly volatile. It was only a matter of time before the accumulated grievances would lead to a full-blown crisis. In March 2011, a seemingly minor incident ignited the powder keg of resentment in Syria. The country had been simmering with discontent for years, with the people growing increasingly frustrated with the oppressive regime of President Bashar al-Assad. In the southern city of Daraa, a group of teenagers, inspired by the Arab Spring protests sweeping across the Middle East and North Africa, spray-painted anti-government slogans on a school wall. These slogans were not just words, they were a bold declaration against years of tyranny and corruption. Their act was a cry for freedom and an end to corruption. It was a desperate plea for change in a country where dissent was met with severe punishment. The government's response was swift and brutal. The regime, known for its iron-fisted rule, could not tolerate such open defiance. Security forces arrested the teenagers and subjected them to torture. The news of their brutal treatment spread like wildfire, igniting a wave of anger and resentment among the populace. This ignited widespread outrage across the country. People who had long been silent found their voices, and the streets of Syria began to fill with protesters. People took to the streets of Daraa and other cities, demanding the release of the children and an end to Assad's rule. The protests were initially peaceful, with demonstrators calling for reforms and greater freedoms. The government responded with force, using live ammunition against unarmed protesters. The regime's violent crackdown only served to escalate the situation. This served only to fuel the flames of rebellion. The more the government tried to suppress the protests, the more determined the people became. What began as peaceful demonstrations quickly escalated into armed resistance. The protesters, realizing that peaceful means were met with violence, began to take up arms to defend themselves. Defectors from the Syrian army, unwilling to fire on their own people, formed the Free Syrian Army. These defectors brought with them military training and weapons, giving the resistance a fighting chance. The country was on the precipice of a brutal civil war. The initial spark in Daraa had ignited a nationwide conflict that would engulf Syria for years to come, changing the lives of millions and altering the course of history. The second half of 2011 saw the Syrian uprising transform into a full-blown civil war. What began as peaceful protests against President Bashar al-Assad's regime quickly escalated into violent confrontations. The government's harsh crackdown on demonstrators only fueled the anger and determination of the opposition. The Syrian army, loyal to Assad, engaged in fierce battles with the Free Syrian Army. The Free Syrian Army, composed of defectors from Assad's forces and civilian volunteers, fought bravely but faced a well-equipped and ruthless opponent. The clashes were intense and often resulted in significant casualties on both sides. Cities like Homs, Hama, and Aleppo became major battlegrounds. These urban centers, once bustling with life, were reduced to rubble as the conflict raged on. The destruction was immense, with entire neighborhoods flattened and countless lives disrupted. The residents of these cities faced unimaginable hardships, caught in the crossfire of a brutal war. The violence escalated rapidly, and by the end of the year the conflict had already claimed thousands of lives. The death toll continued to rise as both sides refused to back down. Civilians bore the brunt of the violence, with many losing their homes, their loved ones, and their sense of security. The humanitarian crisis deepened, with millions of people displaced and in desperate need of aid. The international community condemned the Assad regime's brutal crackdown, but struggled to find a unified response. Diplomatic efforts were made, but they often fell short of achieving any meaningful resolution. The United Nations and various countries called for an end to the violence, but their pleas were largely ignored. The geopolitical complexities of the region made it difficult to reach a consensus on how to address the crisis. The conflict took on a sectarian dimension, with the mainly Sunni opposition pitted against the Alawite-dominated government. This sectarian divide added another layer of complexity to the already volatile situation. The violence was not just political, but also deeply rooted in religious and ethnic tensions. Neighboring countries, each with their own sectarian interests, became involved, further complicating the conflict. This added a dangerous layer of complexity to the conflict, further fueling the violence. The involvement of various factions and foreign powers turned Syria into a battleground for proxy wars. The situation became increasingly chaotic, with no clear path to peace. The hopes of the Syrian people for a swift resolution were dashed as the war dragged on. As the year drew to a close, Syria was engulfed in a chaotic and bloody civil war, with no end in sight. The country was torn apart, its people suffering immensely. The international community watched in horror, but effective intervention remained elusive. The future of Syria looked bleak, with the conflict showing no signs of abating. The nation was ignited, and the flames of war continued to burn fiercely. Gap 3S. As the Syrian Civil War raged on, the international response began to take shape. The world watched in horror as the conflict unfolded, with images of destruction and human suffering flooding global news outlets. International organizations, governments, and humanitarian groups mobilized to address the crisis, each with their own agendas and strategies. The United Nations, at the forefront of diplomatic efforts, made repeated calls for ceasefires and peace talks. However, the Security Council was often deadlocked, with major powers like the United States and Russia at odds over how to handle the situation. Russia, a long-standing ally of the Assad regime, provided military support, including airstrikes that targeted opposition forces. This intervention bolstered Assad's position but also drew international condemnation for the resulting civilian casualties. The United States, on the other hand, supported certain rebel factions, providing them with arms and training. This support was part of a broader strategy to counter the influence of both Assad and extremist groups like ISIS, which had taken advantage of the chaos to expand their territories. The US-led coalition also launched airstrikes against ISIS strongholds, adding another layer of complexity to the already multifaceted conflict. European countries grappled with the influx of Syrian refugees fleeing the violence. Nations like Germany and Sweden opened their doors to those seeking asylum, while others struggled with the political and social ramifications of the crisis. The European Union attempted to coordinate a unified response, but internal divisions often hampered their efforts. Regional powers, including Iran, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, also played significant roles. Iran, a staunch supporter of Assad, provided financial and military aid, including deploying troops and militias to fight alongside Syrian government forces. Turkey, meanwhile, supported various opposition groups and established safe zones along its border, while also dealing with its own security concerns and refugee influx. Saudi Arabia, motivated by sectarian rivalry with Iran, funded and armed certain rebel factions, further intensifying the conflict. Humanitarian organizations like the Red Cross, Médecins Sans Frontières, and the World Food Program worked tirelessly to deliver aid to those in need. However, access was often limited by the ongoing fighting and the politicization of aid delivery. Despite these challenges, countless volunteers risked their lives to provide food, medical care, and shelter to the millions affected by the war. The international response highlighted the geopolitical complexities of the Syrian Civil War. Each player's involvement was driven by a mix of strategic interests, humanitarian concerns, and regional dynamics. The global community's efforts to address the crisis were often fragmented and fraught with challenges, reflecting the broader struggle to find a path to peace. As the conflict continued, the Syrian people bore the brunt of the world's failures and divisions. The international response, while significant, often fell short of bringing about a lasting resolution. The war raged on, and the hopes for a peaceful future remained distant, overshadowed by the relentless cycle of violence. Gap 3S. The international community's engagement in the Syrian Civil War was a testament to both the complexities of modern geopolitics and the enduring human spirit. Despite the challenges, the efforts to bring relief and resolution continued, driven by the unwavering belief that peace, though elusive, was still possible. Gap 3S. As the Syrian Civil War dragged on, the humanitarian crisis reached unprecedented levels. Over half of the Syrian population was displaced, both internally and as refugees in neighboring countries. Families were torn apart, homes were destroyed, and entire communities were uprooted, leaving millions in desperate need of assistance. The refugee crisis placed immense strain on Syria's neighbors. Lebanon, a country with a population of roughly 6 million, took in over 1 million Syrian refugees, dramatically altering its social and economic landscape. Jordan, already grappling with limited resources, hosted hundreds of thousands of refugees in sprawling camps like Zaatari, which became one of the largest refugee settlements in the world. Turkey, sharing a long border with Syria, welcomed more than 3 million Syrians, integrating them into its cities and towns while also establishing refugee camps along the border. Gap 2S. The influx of refugees created significant challenges for host countries. Public services, including healthcare and education, were stretched to their limits. Housing shortages led to soaring rents and overcrowded living conditions, while local labor markets faced increased competition, often leading to tensions between refugees and host communities. Despite these difficulties, many ordinary citizens and local organizations in host countries stepped up to provide support, demonstrating remarkable solidarity and compassion. Within Syria, the situation was equally dire. Internally displaced persons, IDPs, sought refuge in makeshift camps, abandoned buildings, and any available shelter. Humanitarian access was frequently obstructed by ongoing fighting, bureaucratic hurdles, and the deliberate targeting of aid convoys. The lack of clean water, sanitation, and medical care exacerbated the suffering, leading to outbreaks of disease and worsening malnutrition, particularly among children. Gap 2S. International humanitarian organizations worked tirelessly to alleviate the suffering. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, coordinated efforts to provide shelter, food, and medical care to millions of displaced Syrians. Non-governmental organizations like Save the Children, Oxfam, and Care International mobilized resources and volunteers to deliver aid, often at great personal risk. Despite these efforts, the scale of the crisis meant that needs often outstripped available resources, leaving many without adequate assistance. Gap 2S. The humanitarian crisis also had a profound psychological impact. The trauma of war, displacement, and loss left deep scars on the Syrian people, particularly children, many of whom had known nothing but conflict for most of their lives. Mental health services, already limited before the war, struggled to address the widespread trauma. Efforts were made to provide psychosocial support, education, and recreational activities for children in refugee camps and conflict zones, aiming to restore a sense of normalcy and hope. Gap 3S. The Syrian humanitarian crisis underscored the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. It also highlighted the crucial role of international solidarity and support in addressing such large-scale emergencies. As the world grappled with the complexities of the Syrian conflict, the plight of its people remained a stark reminder of the urgent need for peace and stability. Gap 2S. The war may have shattered lives and communities, but the response to the humanitarian crisis revealed the strength and compassion of those who refused to abandon the Syrian people. Even in the darkest times, the collective efforts of countless individuals and organizations provided a glimmer of hope, demonstrating that humanity's capacity for empathy and action can make a difference, even in the face of overwhelming challenges. Gap 3S. As the Syrian Civil War raged on, the chaos and power vacuum created fertile ground for extremist groups to emerge and gain influence. Among these, the rise of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS, marked a turning point in the conflict, introducing a new and terrifying dimension to the war. Gap 2S. ISIS, originally an offshoot of al-Qaeda, capitalized on the instability in Syria and Iraq. By mid-2014, it had seized vast territories across both countries, declaring a so-called caliphate with its capital in Raqqa, Syria. The group's brutal tactics, including mass executions, enslavement, and terror attacks, shocked the world and drew international condemnation. Gap 2S. The presence of ISIS and other extremist factions further complicated the Syrian conflict. Multiple fronts emerged, with the Syrian government, moderate opposition groups, Kurdish forces, and international coalitions all battling not just each other, but also the extremists. This multifaceted war led to even greater suffering for the civilian population, who found themselves caught in the crossfire and subjected to unspeakable atrocities. Gap 3S. The rise of ISIS also had profound regional implications. Neighboring countries faced increased security threats as the group carried out attacks beyond Syria's borders. The international community, recognizing the global threat posed by ISIS, launched a concerted military campaign to dismantle the group's strongholds. Coalition airstrikes, ground offensives by Kurdish and Iraqi forces, and efforts by local militias gradually eroded ISIS's territorial control. Gap 2S. However, the battle against extremism came at a high cost. Cities like Raqqa and Mosul were left in ruins, and the human toll was immense. Civilians endured sieges, bombings, and reprisals, while those who managed to escape faced uncertain futures as refugees or displaced persons. The destruction of infrastructure and loss of life further exacerbated the humanitarian crisis, making recovery and reconciliation even more challenging. Gap 3S. Despite the eventual military defeat of ISIS, the group's ideology continued to inspire lone wolf attacks and radicalization efforts worldwide. The legacy of their reign of terror left deep scars on the region, highlighting the need for comprehensive strategies to address the root causes of extremism, including political disenfranchisement, economic hardship, and social injustice. Gap 2S. The rise and fall of ISIS underscored the complexities of the Syrian conflict and the far-reaching consequences of instability. it also demonstrated the resilience of the Syrian people, who, despite enduring years of brutality and terror, continued to strive for peace and a better future. As the world looked on, the Syrian crisis served as a stark reminder of the dangers of extremism and the importance of international cooperation in the fight against terror. Gap 3S. The impact of extremist groups on Syria and the region will be felt for generations. Yet amid the devastation, stories of resistance, courage, and solidarity emerged, offering a glimmer of hope that even in the darkest times, humanity's resolve to overcome adversity remains unbroken. Gap 3S. In the aftermath of the rise and fall of extremist groups, the Syrian people and the international community have turned their focus towards peace and rebuilding. The journey towards a lasting resolution has been fraught with challenges, but efforts have continued unabated. Gap 2S. The United Nations has been at the forefront of these efforts, spearheading numerous peace talks and negotiations aimed at ending the conflict. The Geneva peace talks, which began in 2012, have seen multiple rounds of discussions involving the Syrian government, opposition groups, and various international stakeholders. Though progress has been slow and often marred by setbacks, these talks have laid the groundwork for potential pathways to peace. Gap 2S. In addition to the UN's efforts, regional powers and international bodies have also played significant roles. Countries like Russia, Iran, and Turkey have been involved in the Astana talks, which have focused on de-escalation zones and ceasefire agreements. While these initiatives have met with varying degrees of success, they represent crucial steps towards reducing violence and building trust among the warring factions. Gap 3S. The humanitarian aspect of the peace efforts cannot be overstated. Organizations such as the International Red Cross, Médecins Sans Frontières, and numerous NGOs have been providing essential aid to those affected by the conflict. Their work in delivering medical care, food, and shelter has been vital in alleviating the suffering of millions of Syrians. Gap 2S. International donors have also contributed to reconstruction efforts, aiming to rebuild the infrastructure devastated by years of war. Schools, hospitals, and homes are being reconstructed, and efforts to restore basic services like water and electricity are ongoing. These initiatives are pivotal in creating a stable environment where peace can take root. Gap 3S. However, the path to peace is not without its obstacles. Political divisions, lingering hostilities, and the presence of remaining extremist elements pose significant challenges. The need for comprehensive solutions that address the underlying causes of the conflict, such as political disenfranchisement, economic hardship, and social inequality, remains critical. Gap 2S. Despite these hurdles, the resilience and determination of the Syrian people continue to shine through. Grassroots movements and local peace-building efforts have emerged, fostering dialogue and reconciliation at the community level. These initiatives, though small in scale, are essential in healing the social fabric torn apart by years of conflict. Gap 3S. The international community's role in supporting these peace efforts is indispensable. Continued diplomatic pressure, economic aid, and humanitarian support are crucial in ensuring that the momentum towards peace is maintained. The lessons learned from the Syrian conflict highlight the importance of global cooperation in resolving complex crises and preventing future conflicts. Gap 2S. As Syria navigates the long and arduous road to recovery, the stories of hope, resilience, and solidarity serve as a testament to the human spirit's capacity to overcome adversity. The quest for peace in Syria is a profound reminder that even in the darkest times, the light of hope and the will to rebuild can guide a nation towards a brighter future. Gap 3S. The journey is far from over, but with unwavering determination and continued international support, there is hope that Syria will one day emerge from the shadows of war into a future of peace and prosperity. Gap 3S. As the dust begins to settle, Syria stands at a crossroads, grappling with the monumental task of rebuilding a nation ravaged by years of relentless conflict. The resilience of its people, coupled with international aid, has set the stage for a new chapter, one of reconstruction, reconciliation, and renewal. Gap 2S. However, the road ahead is fraught with challenges. The physical scars of war are evident in the ruined cities and towns, where homes, schools, and hospitals lie in ruins. Rebuilding this infrastructure is not just a matter of bricks and mortar, it is about restoring the very fabric of society. Gap 2S. Economic recovery is another critical hurdle. The conflict has decimated Syria's economy, leading to widespread unemployment, inflation, and poverty. Efforts to revive the economy are underway, with initiatives focused on job creation, investment in local businesses, and the revitalization of agriculture and industry. Yet the journey towards economic stability remains long and arduous. Gap 3S. Social cohesion is equally vital in the rebuilding process. Years of conflict have left deep-seated divisions and mistrust among different communities. Efforts to promote reconciliation and dialogue are crucial in healing these wounds. Community-based programs led by NGOs and local leaders are playing a pivotal role in fostering understanding and unity among diverse groups. Gap 2S. Education and healthcare systems, once the pride of Syria, have suffered tremendously. Rebuilding schools and hospitals is a priority, but so is addressing the psychological trauma experienced by millions. Programs focused on mental health support, particularly for children and adolescents, are essential in helping the population recover from the horrors of war. Gap 3S. The role of the international community remains indispensable. Continued financial aid, technical assistance, and diplomatic support are crucial in ensuring the success of rebuilding efforts. International organizations and donor countries are working hand in hand with Syrian authorities to implement sustainable development programs that can lay the foundation for a stable and prosperous future. Gap 2S. However, political stability is a significant concern. The lingering presence of extremist groups, ongoing political tensions, and external influences pose threats to the fragile peace. A comprehensive and inclusive political solution is essential in addressing these issues and ensuring long-term stability. Gap 3S. Despite the overwhelming challenges, the spirit of the Syrian people remains unbroken. Stories of communities coming together to rebuild their neighborhoods, of children returning to school, and of families starting anew, are testaments to their enduring hope and determination. Gap 2S. The path to rebuilding Syria is undoubtedly complex and fraught with obstacles, but it is also filled with opportunities for renewal and growth. With unwavering resolve and the continued support of the international community, Syria can rise from the ashes, stronger and more united. Gap 3S. The journey of rebuilding is not just about restoring what was lost, but about creating a future where peace, prosperity, and harmony can flourish. It is a journey that requires collective effort, resilience, and a steadfast belief in the possibility of a brighter tomorrow. Gap 3S. As Syria takes its first steps towards this new beginning, the world watches with hope and solidarity, ready to support the nation in its quest for a peaceful and prosperous future. Gap 3S.